Thank you everyone for attending today. This talk is called Designing for Your Team, Designing with Empathy for Productive Teams and Enjoyable Collaboration. So Nicole already gave a great introduction. Just to give a bit more, my name is Daisy Mølving. I'm a senior designer, pronouns are she, her. I'm based in London and I've been at 8thlight for about 7 years now. As Nicole mentioned, I started my career as a developer and I did that with 8thlight for a few years. And then I shifted over to design, as that was where my passions lay. And my role as a designer is rather broad, starting with UX research through designing UIs and prototypes, building out design systems, to occasional front-end development work. And much of that depends on the project and the client needs there. So I spend a lot of time thinking about not just how I can design the client software product, but also how I can design the project. How can I set things up so that all team members and stakeholders feel invested in our design effort? And my developer past has also been really helpful when collaborating within integrated teams. And that has been much of the inspiration for this talk, considering how developers think when they go about putting your designs into development, and also how that process should be optimized. And then, of course, spreading that out to the wider team, not just developers as well. So as UX designers, we consider 3 things when we're designing software products. The desirability of the product, are we meeting the human need? The feasibility of the product, what technologies are we using, considering our team's skills and tools, and viability, are we meeting business goals? So we tend to think of desirability as the only one of those pillars that considers users, but I'd like to challenge that. Let's also consider the rest of our team as users, not of the final product, of course, but as users of your design outputs. So then if we look again at those pillars of feasibility, desirability, and viability, in terms of who is invested in and responsible for their success, we see our team. We see developers responsible for feasibility, business stakeholders and product owners as responsible for viability, and other designers, as well as ourselves, responsible for desirability. So all of these people in some way need to interact with our design outputs, not just our end users. So in this talk, we're going to look at the many ways that you can practice empathy for your teammates' needs, and also some tips and tricks in how you might meet them. We're going to wear the many hats of software creation to understand how our teammates might interact with our work. Don't read too much into the potential symbolism of each of these silly hats, but we have a stakeholder hat, the developer hat, our hat is the chicken one because I like that one the best, the product owner hat, and the other designer hat. So what are we going to look at? So we're going to figure out the various ways that we can ensure that our teammates can navigate the file, learn the software, understand documentation, faithfully build components, and review and critique designs, all with the end result of successful and fun collaboration. So this is by no means the list of things to do. If you're regularly collaborating and empathizing with your team, then you know what would work best in that circumstance, and perhaps you already have your own processes around that. I would like this talk to serve as inspiration rather than a strict set of rules. And another note is I'm going to be showing examples using Figma, as that's the software I'm using most often, but these concepts could apply to whichever design software you're using. So let's get started. First of all, we want to ensure that your team can navigate the file. Your team's ability to navigate your design file is the first step in them getting to know your designs. It gives them confidence to find what they need quickly, And developers who can find what they need can understand your designs from a feasibility standpoint early, and they can implement your designs effectively. Product owners who can find what they need can prioritize design as part of the delivery process, and they can easily advocate for design's importance to stakeholders. But they might come across a few hurdles. Over the course of your project, you'll create a bunch of different files. For instance, UI files, you might have one UI file for each flow, or one for all of them. You might have design system files that could be split into their own files or even own project. You probably have some FigJam files for research, synthesis, brainstorming, ideation, critiques and presentations, analogous research, workshop resources, you name it. So putting your team hats on and looking at this project can be pretty overwhelming. So what can we do to help them? So putting our designer hat back on, we can make the most relevant files more discoverable for our team. So at the root of your project, where all of your Figma files live, Figma will sort your files by last modified by default. So in my designer hat, I know that if I sort to alphabetical and then I number the most important files, then those will be prioritized in the list for easy discovery. So now that your teammate has found their way into your UI file, they're met with a bunch of pages internally and questions. There are various categories of components. There's so many workflows, there's prototypes. So how do they even know where to start? And how do they find what they're looking for in that file? So designer hat time again. I recommend creating a cover page as the first item in the pages list so that your users will automatically land here when they open the file. And that cover page can contain a description of the file or the product that it contains. It can have helpful links for onboarding, setup instructions, maybe a table of contents. And as a bonus, this cover page will also be the thumbnail for that file in your project. So you can also make it satisfactorily good looking if you're into that. But your teammate still might have this issue that they're new to Figma and they're just in a hurry. And sure, they'll learn the software when they have time, but right now they're in a meeting with their boss and they just need to reference that particular part of the login flow that you were talking about the other day. So make them look good by providing them with an easy way to find that workflow that requires zero Figma knowledge. The designer in this chicken hat is going to create a table of contents on their cover page with links to every page in our file. So those who are not familiar with how to navigate Figma using the pages in the left panel will understand how to click a link presented to them. So remember what your users are familiar with. Maybe navigation patterns of the web, PDF or ebook tables of contents, and try to mimic that. Additionally, in clicking that link, they may also notice the pages in the left panel changing. So that empowers them as well to learn the software by doing. Moving from Figma to FigJam now, where, as we know, FigJam files can grow pretty large. And once they get to a particular scale, anyone could easily get lost. Your teammates might say, the FigJam is massive. I remember there were some concepts you showed on Friday, but how can I find them? So first things first, we want to make it outrageously obvious where the file starting point is. And from here, we can again create a table of contents with links to each of our major sections. We also want to ensure that we use sections with sensible titles. And obviously the benefit of sections, as we know, is that those titles can be read at any zoom level. And a few ideas for naming those. So one idea is that we could have numbering for the sections preceding their title to show the intended order of flow through the file. We can use terminology, notation, or title structure that your team is already familiar with. So for instance, if in Jira or Trello or GitLab tickets, your team maybe writes a ticket with the epic in square brackets and a category preceding a colon, and then all of the detail after that. Then maybe you might do the same here. And you can also include the date in your section titles, particularly for meetings and workshops that you had your team participate in on a particular day. So all of these naming conventions, if they make sense to your team, they not only make things easier for them to find by scrolling around, but also just for searching when they're using the Control F function. Okay, so next we want to ensure that your team can learn the software. Regardless of what your team members' experience is, you want them to feel empowered when they're interacting with your design files. Just like we want our end users to feel empowered when they're interacting with our final product. So by learning the software, your team can learn the skills that they need to interact with your designs productively, so that they can understand and review and inspect your designs. They can leave feedback and ask questions, and they themselves can work efficiently. And they also are able to feel empowered to work independently when that is needed, while still having a greater ability to collaborate. However, this is a possibility for any teammate. Even other designers may have used different software to you. So it could be their first time using Figma and they're totally overwhelmed. Secondly, even those who have used your chosen software before might only be familiar with features from, say, 6 months ago when they were on that other project, and things have changed loads since then. For instance, Figma's annual conference config has been on this past week, and it's quite possible that some of these workaround tips may be changed in some ways based on new features they're releasing right now. Things can change super quickly around here. So how might we help our teammates feel empowered when they open up our Figma or our other design software? So first things first, we can hold a session to take your team through the design file and any useful Figma tips step by step. We can give them access to that file before we have that session, so then they are able to try out those features along with us. And then, of course, follow up with them so we can have a check-in afterwards. We could direct them to any further resources or summarize what we did together in a message, for instance. But there may be more you can do, because your teammate could experience this issue. You did show me how to do this, but I've forgotten the details, and now I'm stuck while you're away. So no team member, including yourself, can be available for questions all the time. There's lunch, there's working in different time zones, there's stepping out to get some daylight on your design hat every now and then. And we also want our teammates we want to give our teammates the power to learn on their own terms in their own time. So how can we give them that knowledge gift even when we're not available? Most simply by ensuring that there are any links to helpful documentation, including Figma tutorials, on your cover page so that they're really easy to access. Of course, help.figma.com has excellent written documentation and videos to help with this, so you can just nab from there. But if you think a more personalized touch will help, then you can create your own recordings, so screen record or Loom. You could even get 2 birds with 1 bean and just record the meeting where you gave that introduction to Figma to your team with their consent, of course. And that also means that any questions that were asked there are addressed in perpetuity for others, and then provide that link on your cover page as well. But still, putting our teammates' hats back on, sometimes it's just hard to retain information when you're not actively engaged with it at the time. And also, it's a lot to just start from scratch. I also wouldn't be surprised or upset if you forget a whole lot of this talk, for instance. It's pretty usual for your teammate to nod along and understand, but not really retain the steps of the process until it's time to get stuck into that work. And then at that point, it can be a little bit harder to remember due to other pressures. So what can we provide our teammates with so it's easier for them to learn by doing before the stakes are high? So one idea is to create an onboarding task. So first of all, think about what your teammate should learn. So maybe if they're a product owner, it would be useful to teach them how to navigate, read and write comments, and copy links to both pages and frames. But if they're a developer, instead, it might be, well, also useful to teach them how to navigate, read and write comments, but additionally, use the layers panel, inspect components and frames, understand properties, styles, effects, interactions. So for instance, an onboarding task for a developer could look like a comment on the cover page, atting them with a start here, and asking them to say navigate to the wireframes page for the login flow to find the login modal. And then once they're there, another comment could instruct them to click into that page frame until they find the modal instance, and then right click to go to the main component. And then once they're at that main component for the modal, a comment could instruct them to inspect it. So maybe ask them to write a comment back to you to tell you, say, what the background color is, or what the default width and rem is, or the typography style of the title. So once they've got to this point, they've had a taste of every activity that they need to learn to develop from your Figma designs. And also encourage them to ask questions that they might have about that task or any other Figma functionality that they come across. Get some feedback about what maybe you might have missed to improve your next teammate's onboarding experience. All right, so next we want to ensure that your team can understand the documentation. So of course, documentation and the understanding of it can get everybody on the same page. It makes all of your implementation easier through clear guidance for developers. And it also sparks important team discussions around assumptions of interactivity, intent, or feasibility. So understanding is mega important. How can we get there? So first of all, it's rad that you have documentation. That makes the developers' work much easier. And having documentation that can be played as a prototype would allow the developer to see interactions, maybe such as hover animations in action. So that's great. Only thing is it obvious to the dev that they should play that documentation frame in order to see the hover behavior? And even if they do know to do this, it can be a little bit fiddly selecting the correct frame to play. So take the guesswork out of it by providing a link to play the docs. So first of all, that presents the playable documentation as a possibility in the first place. And secondly, it does the job in just one click. So you'll see here at the beginning, it's essentially just a link on the docs that can be clicked to instantly open any documentation. But devs aren't the only ones who need to access design documentation. Product owners want to share designs with stakeholders, maybe for sign-off, but without getting those stakeholders too deep into the weeds. And by in the weeds, really, I mean like too deep into the design file. Product owners also need to be able to reference your designs in project management software, maybe like Jira, Trello, Asana, and so on, in order to put your work on tickets. So that playable documentation, again, provides a nice level of detail to a stakeholder without requiring them to get too deep into the weeds of your design file. And that product owner can really easily share that link with them. Of course, that link can also be attached to task cards in any project management software. So that benefits any developer that picks up that task. Alrighty, so your documentation shows buttons of every hierarchy, state, size, and icon configuration, which allows a developer to recreate them in code easily, which is great. But now it's time for maybe another designer and a developer from your team to collaborate on a new customer onboarding flow. And it isn't super clear to either of them when and where to use each type of button. So they might say, I don't understand when and how to use primary, secondary, and tertiary buttons, either together or by themselves. So this means that you need to ensure that your documentation includes a description of both the usage and the intent of every component, not just descriptions of its attributes. Additionally, you can show examples of those components used in the context of a page or a larger component. So for instance, here, an example of a sticky footer for a form that contains the primary, secondary, and tertiary actions. And by keeping such examples in your documentation, rather than out in the wild of your wireframes, makes them easily accessible. It keeps them close to those guidelines. And it also means that they won't be changed or deleted like wireframes can be by shifting design priorities. Alrighty, so what a pain for your developer teammate. They're working on building out this loading state of the login model while authentication is happening. Maybe there's a little spinner going around, and they'd like to see it triggered and fade out a few times to understand the interactions. The problem is they need to fill out all of the login details in the form of that modal in order to submit it and then trigger it. And they don't need to do that just once. Every time they want to see that interaction, they have to go back and perform this action again. How very labor intensive, right? So if we think of your prototypes as documentation of your designs, there are some ways we can make them easier to follow. And one of them is to use the flow starting point feature in the prototype panel to add milestones. So one milestone for this form could be when it is blank, one when there is an inline error, one when it is successfully submitted, one when there is a submission error, one while it is authenticating. And this makes it very easy for a developer to just skip to the part of the design that they're focused on building. It also makes it easy for you when you're presenting prototypes to others and someone says, hold on, can I see that part again? And you just have one little click and you're there. These flow starting points also may be sort of confusingly named because they don't really have to be the start of anything, and that they don't really need to be a step in a flow at all. You can just use them to mark out your documentation frames, like a table of contents almost, for example, shown here. So here they're used to present all of our design system styles pages, almost as a little catalog to just be skipped through. So as designers, we often need to annotate our wireframes so that our intent is clear. And we also like to make our design files look cohesive and tidy. However, we should resist the temptation to make our annotations or our notes blend into the design. For instance, for a developer who is trying to discern the difference between an annotation directed at them and an information banner component directed at the end user as part of the UI, this can get confusing and frustrating. And also adding to that, it's much easier to miss these sort of blended in annotations altogether, which is definitely not the point of them. So we should make our annotations unlike any part of our UI. So we could style them differently, use different colors, fonts, even make them super ugly if we want, so that they stand out against our beautiful UI. So one tip could be to use Figma's default purple color to mark notes, that color that they already use to border component variants. And this will kind of make it look like it's part of the Figma UI rather than the product's UI. Of course, that is if your product doesn't use a similar purple as a brand color. And additionally, you could also use some iconography that is different to your products to distinguish annotations at a glance. Additionally, your UI file isn't the only place that needs to contain documentation. So any files containing design process artifacts serve this purpose. So putting your product owner hat on and listening to the voices of stakeholders asking for updates on the design work stream. And those voices grow louder as you open the Figma project, and louder still as you view all of the files there. But to your horror, nothing is organized. You can't find the project timeline. Where are the notes from that kickoff meeting or the presentation that the designer gave in the design thinking workshop? Are they here? Are they in the Google Drive? Are they even just sitting on the designer's local desktop? So putting your design hat back on, you could create a FigJam file that contains and organizes all of this content. So think of this like a living document, like a one-stop shop for all things design for your project. Of course, it's very, very important that this one-stop shop is well organized and easy to reference. So again, remembering back to using sensibly named sections and linking them to a table of contents. But here you could make a record of all major meetings, workshops, and design activities, remembering that some artifacts won't be in FigJam, so such as Google Docs, spreadsheets, Figma UI files, but you could provide links to them here. Also think about who is looking at this file and their differing needs. So another designer maybe wants to get really deep into the weeds of this file, but a product owner might just want to access certain sections or file links only. And for a stakeholder, maybe just a glance at a meeting agenda or an outcomes presentation is enough. Alrighty, so this one's for the devs, making sure that your team can faithfully build components. And of course, we want this to be done well because we want our work to be presented to the end user at its best. And we also want to make it easy for developers to implement our intentions. But Frog Hat Developer has a little problem. There are so many styles in this file to implement into code, and it's not easy for them to understand where to use them. They might say, so many colors, so many names. Have I missed any? Where are they used? So let me elaborate on this issue a little bit. I've seen plenty of design files with, say, a range of grays with names like gray, lighter gray, lightest gray, light gray too. And that gets pretty muddling quick. Or alternatively, maybe we want to distinguish the names, so we call them things like ash gray, storm gray, charcoal gray, and so on. But the names in both of those examples are really ambiguous as to how to use the values of the color range. And of course, if colors aren't being used properly, not only is our design not well represented, but we also run into visual accessibility issues. So let's ensure that colors are easy to use correctly, ensuring visual accessibility, and don't make the developer think. So when we name typography styles, we usually name their context for use. So we might say body, bold, or label, or heading, or link. And we could do something similar for colors. So how might we categorize colors? So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, as I like to say, already gives accessibility categories of normal text, which we could apply to body text and labels, large text, which we could apply to headings, and graphical objects and user interface components. So that would include things like borders, dividers, and maybe larger iconography. So if we split our grayscale color range into, say, a light side, so lighter than the middle, and a dark side, darker than the middle, then we could name our values something like this. Maybe we have light background, light text, heading, light UI. Then from the middle out again, we have dark UI, dark heading, dark text, dark background. So this now allows us to document rules for how those will be used together, such as dark text can only layer upon a light background for accessible contrast, or a light heading can only layer upon a dark background for accessible contrast, or dark UI objects can only layer upon a light background for accessible contrast. So this contextual naming is making it really easy to understand how the colors are being used. And it also means if you as a designer make a mistake in applying the colors, then a developer acts as a second layer of quality control, so they can alert you to this possible mistake. There's also another way to name colors. If you have a wider range of values for each color in your UI, then perhaps you would rather name them using number values. So for instance, from black to white and all the grays in between, you may have 11 values ranging from 0 to 1,000, climbing in increments of 100. But Daisy, that naming doesn't describe how to use those colors in context. Well, while this way of naming doesn't explicitly describe context, it does help us use colors accessibly by letting us do some easy maths. So for instance, if you have two color values used together, one is the foreground and one is the background, if we minus the lower value from the higher value, then we could say that the result should be 600 or greater for body text and labels on their background, 500 or greater for headings and iconography on their background, 400 or greater for UI elements such as borders and dividers on their background. So once again, we're making these rules really easy for our developer teammates to follow. Design software, Figma included, allows the designer to group layers together in a file without needing any structure necessarily. So for instance, in order to put a title on a white card, all I have to do is make sure that the title layer is above the card layer in the layers list. And then I can basically position the layers in the view panel however I like, and voila, I'm done. This is very unlike HTML and CSS, which describe each element and its positional relationship to other elements. So it can mean that your dev colleague is doing some mental gymnastics to translate your design layers then into code, which of course leaves more room for mistakes and misinterpretation of what your intention is. So don't make them think. We can structure layers like you're writing HTML. So you can see HTML on the right there and the layers on the left there. We can use auto layout in order to group relatives and describe their position relational to each other. And then, of course, also name those layers to describe their intent. So I don't want to see a layer named 2561 in a design file. It's very unhelpful. You could even possibly go in the direction of using the same naming convention that a developer uses for their classes, but that's not strictly necessary so long as the name itself describes what the class might be. All right, so nice work on naming your layers. But what about naming your component properties? So a component property is analogous perhaps to a prop in a React component. And when you create a component property, Figma gives you a default name, but often that name doesn't really describe the intent behind the property. So for instance, I'm designing a modal, and in some cases, I want the user to be able to just read that modal and close it. But in some cases, I want to force them to maybe enter information and save it. I don't want them to just be able to close the modal instantly. So when I create this modal, I'd give it a Boolean property on the close button. So for instance, for each instance of that modal, I can decide whether the close should be available or not. So Figma gives me the default name of show button, which I can then set to true or false. But that name doesn't tell the developer when or why that button should or shouldn't be shown. So with your designer hat on, think about how you could name that Boolean component property to give context of the situation in which it is available or not. So it's available when the modal is closable. So perhaps is closable is a much more descriptive name than show button. And that can also start a conversation with your dev teammate about other implications of a closable modal. So for instance, in the code, the is closable Boolean type could also control whether the modal can be closed by clicking outside of its boundary, for instance, rather than just clicking the button. So lastly, we want to ensure that our team can review and critique our designs. And this is important because it obviously improves design quality through feedback. It also provides a chain of accountability, and giving your team channels for review and input builds trust and investment in your design. So this can be a bit of a stressful situation when you're wearing your own chicken designer hat or the developer hat. A stakeholder just wants to see how some feature could work. So the client has asked for a quick prototype of this new page and just to understand X functionality, but it might get thrown away anyway. Does it make sense to invest a lot of design effort when this feature is potentially sacrificial? And well, maybe you could discuss and decide that with your team based on the context. But there are some cases where we just want to see something in action to know its feasibility. And then maybe we're going to apply design to it later in the process. And of course, we can't die on every design hill. But at the same time, we don't want that stakeholder to be presented with something that fulfills the functionality, but has a terrible experience. And then they're like, ship it. So how can we ensure that it's easy for our dev teammate to throw something together, but it's also clear to the stakeholder that there hasn't been a design pass over that feature yet? With lo-fi variants of your components. So by building out component variants, keep getting mixed up between those words, that are styled in a low fidelity way in both designs and in development, then we are clearly presenting that the concept or prototype is in a sketch phase. And this, of course, is also super useful when you're testing with users, of course, in both Figma and in Code prototypes. So making low fidelity variants of your components also makes them easy to swap out for the real thing with just a click of a button when the design is becoming more refined. So yourself or another designer might say that once the devs have built out these components, I need to be able to review and ensure parity between Figma and Code. Design and development should always be collaborative. We don't do either in a vacuum. The design team shouldn't just be handing over wireframes and just dusting off their hands, just as developers shouldn't be implementing design as code without review and feedback. So we need eyes on each other's work so that we can ensure that the product is the best that it can be. But how can a designer easily review code regardless of whether they can read or write it? So a tool like Storybook to document, review, and test UI components and code is perfect for this, because designers can also view and inspect their coded designs here, and they can give feedback potentially before they're even deployed to users. And that's not all. So there is a Figma plugin called Storybook Connect, and that allows side-by-side comparison of Figma components and Storybook components in your Figma file for really easy review. So to set this up, Storybook is securely and privately deployed using Chromatic, and then links to each Storybook component can then be applied to Figma components through that Storybook Connect plugin, thus creating a pipeline for improved quality. So you can see here how a designer could potentially look at a storybook story right next to the associated Figma component and then give feedback to the dev about what needs to change or whether it can be signed up. But it's not just designers that need oversight of this component and wireframe development, of course. Product owners need to be able to give sign off too. So remember how we deployed our storybook with Chromatic? Well, Chromatic also provides tools for reviewing and approving deployed versions. So as you can see here, it can be easy to ensure that everyone in the chain can provide their expertise when it's needed. All right, tips over. That was a lot. So putting those into practice can be a lot of work, and there's a lot to consider, especially if you're partway through a large project and you're not starting from scratch. Can be a little bit overwhelming. So how can we do all of this? So a few suggestions. First of all, working some of these tips into your workflow step by step and only applying them maybe just as they become necessary. So for instance, you probably don't need to create an onboarding task until someone new joins the team. It's also important to figure out what your team needs right now. So gather feedback about what is working for them and what isn't, maybe pay close attention in those retros so you can prioritize what to set up for them as you go along. Thirdly, if you can, either by yourself or with the support of other team members, negotiate with your client some time to tackle design debt. So a way to sell this work is for its many productivity benefits, not just for yourself as a designer and your ability to work efficiently, but also for the rest of your team too. So sharing how it will make working with those designs easier and more efficient, but also describing to your client how those gains in efficiency will move them closer to their business goals, because they love that. And lastly, building templates. So once you've set up your design file in a particular way once, and you've employed some of these tips, you can make templates of them to use time and time again. So for instance, if you are creating a cover page, you might have much of the same resources on that across projects. So you could reuse it potentially. Maybe the frame that contains documentation for your UI components might have the same layout or even much of the same text, sort of describing each of your most basic components. So as well as making your teammates' work lives easier, be smart about how you can make your own work life easier too. Also, if you only remember one thing from this talk, you could pretty much disregard every tip if you just aim to empathize with your team's needs and think about wearing all of their hats while you're looking at your work.